Thanks for tuning in and welcome to the weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. My name is Shannon Boucher. My co-host Melanie Bennett is off on some travels this week, and I'm joined by James Pugh, the publisher and founder of Woke Watch Canada today as my guest co-host. We're going to learn a bit about James's projects in a minute or two. I wanted to share with you some of the big stories that we're covering this week in the weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. Of course, the elephant in the room or the giant issue is the witch trial of Amy Hamm in British Columbia. She's the embattled nurse whose license is on the line. She's into the teens in terms of the numbers of days of hearings required by the BC College of Nurses and Midwives to determine if she gets to continue to practice as a nurse. More interference by Trudeau's Rainbow proxy, Egale Canada, who we've been talking about for a few weeks, this time in New Brunswick with Blaine Higgs. Some news from Blaine Higgs as well. Jon Montpetit of CBC notoriety, a senior investigative journalist, did a hit piece on a Canadian researcher, Dr. James Cantor, who has been researching issues related to gender and sexuality for decades, and a woke BC school trustee, Carin Bondar, who beat embattled trustee Barry Neufeld last fall for the seat in Chilliwack, says parents against SOGI are obsessed with children's genitals. We're covering two pieces by Barbara Kay in the National Post this week, and yet another progressive council conspires to discipline a member of for wrongthink. Lisa Robinson, the councillor, was suspended from the Pickering Municipal Council this week, and we'll get into some details. My apologies to viewers this week. I've had some technical difficulties with my recording of this week's Canadian Gender Wars Report. We're going to join my conversation with James Pugh, editor and publisher of Woke Watch Canada newsletter, partially in progress. And I hope you'll forgive the technical difficulties we've had this week. I hope to get James on again soon to talk a little bit more about what he's been doing with Woke Watch Canada and with his various subject areas that he's publishing. And nevertheless, I think we had a terrific conversation. We covered an awful lot of ground in the Canadian Gender Wars world this week in the absence of Melanie Bennett, who is currently traveling, and I hope you enjoy.
Sure.
For years, it was possible for a politically neutral, responsibly well-informed Canadian or American to believe that prescribing puberty blockers to pause natural physical changes in gender-confused children was an ethical means of soothing their distress. It was even possible to believe that without that pause, a child's distress might lead to suicidal ideation. Thus, there was a case to be made for transition affirmation. But no more, according to Barbara Kay. Engaged observers are aware that the affirmation model has fallen out of favor in many European countries. The reasons why are spelled out in such documents as the Cass Review of 2022, the interim report in the United Kingdom, which resulted in the closure of England's premier gender identity clinic. Now, Jon Montpetit didn't get the memo. He's still talking about puberty blockers being reversible. He and I had that discussion last year, and I sent him follow-up documents and credible evidence that this wasn't the case. But it appears that other people are starting to get the memo, and listening to James Cantor this past week, going through his resume and all of his experience and research was, I imagine it was really difficult for the panel in the BC College of Nurses and Midwives to reconcile the ideological narratives with the science. Someone else in BC isn't getting the memo either, and that's Carin Bondar. Had you heard of her before this week, James?
Yeah, I've seen her on X.
Okay.
Yeah, she's always like that. That's her personality, you know.
Yeah, I mean, she seems, photogenic and charismatic. She's got a good presence on the screen, but the stuff coming out of her mouth, it's quite bizarre. There was a mashup this week because she hosts this show and she's made her platform. She's a biologist of some sort, and her show is called Wild Sex, which is animal kingdom stuff about biology. But she's been she pushes the envelope a little bit in terms of wild sex and human sexual content and the mashup video. Maybe I'll put a link to it. Um,
I couldn't get through it, Shannon. I could only watch about half of it because I knew I
yeah,
had to watch it. I literally I wanted to shut it off right away as soon as she started talking about her take on the hands off our kids.
yeah,
Like right away, anyone who's saying hands off our kids, we don't really think your hands are actually on our kids. If we
yeah.
thought that, we wouldn't be saying hands off our kids. You would
So
have fathers,
why don't
in your face.
I'm going to splice the video in here, James. So let's have a look at that, and we can dig a little bit deeper. We'll share it with the audience,
Sure.
what she said, and then come back to it in just a second.
Hey there, good morning. Good afternoon. It is Monday, October the 23rd, and I am Carin Bondar. I wanted to jump on today and do a video about some common yet completely not true things that I have heard lately about things happening in our schools with, in the greater context of the transgender student issue. Okay, let's just kick it off. Number one, hands off our kids is a slogan that is repeated over and over by these people. Nobody's hands are on children in schools. This is something that would be defined as child abuse if people were putting their hands on children in schools. And there's, significant policy work in place so that people do not have hands on your kids in school. Okay, that's number one. Number two, stop sexualization of children. This is an interesting one. The learning materials that were developed for the province of British Columbia under the umbrella of inclusive education, these are the SOGI resources, do not sexualize children in any way. Here is what they do. They encourage children to understand that there are other people in the world, people that may not be the same as them. That is what SOGI tries to impart on others. Here is, I think, a place where people are struggling. People are struggling that younger children might be exposed to another choice, this middle choice or transgender choice. I hear from people, they are afraid of their children being confused and sexualized. Okay, so I actually see two things with this particular issue of stopping sexualization of children. The first issue is the sexualization. I would actually argue that these protesters are hell-bent on sexualizing children because it is all they ever talk about. They're obsessed with genitals and sex and things they don't understand. Okay, so I don't remotely agree that this is a sexualizing curriculum or set of learning resources. Okay. And then the second one is about gender, is about this notion of, oh my goodness, my child is so confused now. And so I want to go ahead and just have that conversation. Let's pretend I have someone here that is saying, oh my goodness, my child is super confused now. They've gone to school, they've gotten this information, they don't understand what's happening to them anymore. Now they think they're a girl, now they think they're a boy. And then, okay, so that happens on a day. So then I will say to you or to that person, I will say, okay, well then what? Then what happened? Like what happened after dinner? What happened after that child told you they were super confused? What happened? And most oftentimes they will say, well, they went to bed and then you got up and went to school the next day. And the next day they were confused too. And it, continued to be confusing for them. And I say, oh, okay. So what happened the next week after that when they, learned about this information and they were considering whether or not they were a boy or a girl, or maybe somewhere in between. And what happened next? And invariably, parents in our district will say, oh, well, yeah, they were confused and they changed their mind again. And they had an altercation or, a little argument with a friend at school about it, or, whatever the social dynamics of the situation may be. I actually went through this with my youngest child, and I took her very seriously. Children are little people, and we don't dismiss them as people who can't talk about who they are and what they want. So for probably about a year and a half, my youngest was a whole bunch of different things. And that's not to say that trans children are confused. My child is not trans, but she went through this whole phase where she was considering it. And I actually think we're seeing this more in young girls, because young girls mature faster. They are very social. They love each other at young ages. And I think this makes them, sure, there's confusion. That's okay. There should be confusion when you're young. Now, this brings me to my next point, which is the furry issue. This is number 3, that I still do get people asking me if we have litter boxes, if there's litter boxes in schools. And the answer is no. There are no litter boxes for children in school at all. And yep, there is this thing called a furry craze. It's a furry craze. And I will tell you that my child also was a furry for a while. And the only thing I ever said to that child every day that they were something different, a furry, a demi girl, a demi boy, a trans girl, a trans boy, like everything, I would only ever say, okay, I love you no matter what. That's it.
So, James, you're right about the hands off our kids thing. One of the other slogans of the parents' rights movement is leave our kids alone.
Yeah.
Which is how I quote tweeted her and I responded to her in that sense. Like, it's ridiculous for you to suggest that that parents are saying that children are being touched by teachers on a massive scale in order to discredit. But she managed to discredit herself. The big thing with the parents' rights movement, as it's been labeled, is that we don't want gender ideology taught in school, and it's the no more secrets issue that's being addressed in Saskatchewan with Scott Moe's notwithstanding clause in the new parents' rights bill, and in New Brunswick with Blaine Higgs. We've had talk from leadership in Ontario, from the Conservative Party, some words spoken, but we have yet to see any real action. That we don't want secret social transition of children in schools, right? Like, they haven't got the memo, like Barbara Kay was saying. A reasonable person at one point could have made these conclusions, but the evidence is just too significant right now. What Bondar said was that her own child, her daughter, thought she was trans, thought she was a demi-girl and demisexual, and thought she was a cat. Right. So, there's a lot of this stuff about litter boxes in school, and that's been thoroughly debunked. As far as I know, there's been no confirmed litter box in any school. It's a joke, an urban legend, but it's not a joke, because I've talked to teachers as well here in Ottawa where they have kids who were identifying as animals. In one case, I talked to a teacher 10 days ago, and there's a cat identified child in the 8th grade who's running around on all fours at recess or whatever breaks and lunches. It's bizarre. Just like a 50-year-old man identifying as a 13-year-old, right? Like, this self-identification doesn't have any rational boundaries anywhere. Yes. So Bondar's claim that her, let her daughter explore her identities, fair enough. If that's what we want people to do, and or progressive people want to let their kids do. The problem is when schools are affirming this, not allowing kids to explore, but the moment a child self-identifies and an activist teacher is involved, they will concretize that child's exploration of gender identity. And they will facilitate, in secret from parents, this social transition. Their teachers aren't psychologists. So Bondar, on one hand, is saying, parents are genital fetishists, obsessed with children's genitals, which is one of the most disgusting and cheap and ridiculous retorts by the progressive left about this issue. But also saying that she allowed her daughter to explore her identities, which absolutely makes the case for her as a school trustee to wake up and say, hey, wait a sec, if this is exploration is going to happen, we can't concretize identities. So really, really, I don't think it's the last we're going to hear from Carin Bondar. I think there's still a lawsuit going on because Barry Neufeld, who I've known for a couple of years, was the trustee she replaced in Chilliwack, BC. And Barry was attacked by the head of the BC Teachers Federation, Glenn Hansman, going back like 6 years ago, when Barry spoke out against SOGI. And he ended up having a hearing in the Supreme Court last fall in October. And it was during his election campaign. So he took time out from the trustee election campaign to come to Ottawa to have his appeal heard before the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court took the woke position that because these transgender kids are historically marginalized and oppressed, it's in the public interest for an institution like the BC Teachers Federation with, I think it's 70,000 plus teachers, to use its weight as an institution to destroy an individual's personal reputation by lying and calling them names. It's absolutely bizarre. And along the way, as court cases were flying and the campaign was happening, Barry Neufeld pointed to some of Bondar's more risque videos, because like I said, not just wild sex in the animal kingdom, but she was swinging naked on a wrecking ball, like a Miley Cyrus thing, and she's appeared in bondage gear and all kinds of stuff in videos. And Neufeld said he felt she was acting like a prostitute or something to that effect. So she filed a defamation case against him. So anyhow, it's not the last we'll hear of Bondar. I invited her to come on the Gender Wars Report. I got no response, although and I suggested a debate too. Like, look, if you want to make these allegations, why don't you join a panel or debate somebody who's on the other side of the issue, rather than just put out this. Anyway, we'll see if we hear from them. Yeah. Where are we in our flow here, James? We've covered off, Egale Canada. We talked about Jon Montpetit and James Cantor, Carin Bondar.
One point I thought that we should mention was in the Barabara article, the one that was about the ideological logjam. She makes a really good point that with what happened in Finland recently with the Council for Choices in Healthcare, that kind of represents a bit of a turning point, because it's the first time international experts have weighed in on the gender affirming care debate in the U.S. So with like all these European countries kind of waking up, and Canada and the United States still plowing ahead. And then, but what's good is that these international experts are saying, why aren't you pausing? All these other gender clinics are realizing that, whoa, we went a little too quick on this. Which maybe this might be a good segue. I watched a little bit of the documentary that you sent me too on the Dutch protocol.
Yep.
And what I found interesting about that one was the doctor that they were interviewing, who was, I guess, one of the architects of the Dutch protocol, I've never seen a doctor do this before. A doctor that sort of is for transitioning children. This doctor was distinguishing between the original group that they had studied, which were kids that had shown signs of gender dysphoria from very early on in their childhood, from infancy, and
almost entirely boys, if I'm not mistaken. Almost entirely or entirely. Yeah, there was 72 members of that study.
Yeah, and the more recent waves of the studies, it's almost the exact opposite. all of the kids, the gender dysphoria became like is onset in like early adolescence.
Yes.
So, I mean, that is something that these doctors and people should have been, that should have been the first thing that they were looking at years ago.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's good that they're kind of talking in this language now, because it seems like that the most radical, hardline trans people of the medical infrastructure are starting to walk back their claims. They're never going to admit that they were wrong about anything. They'll just sort of walk it back, and they'll say, "Oh, well, new evidence is pointing this way now," and whatever. And it's like, fine, if that's how they're going to stop hurting kids, then I don't care how they stop it. But it seems like that's kind of what is happening. People know that there's all these looming lawsuits coming.
Yeah.
So it's positive, I think.
Yeah. Barbara Kay mentions Roy Epen. Roy is an endocrinologist from Montreal. He's also, I think he's run for Conservative Party, or he's held offices as a Conservative. He is of course, a medical doctor. He wrote in the New York Post an article earlier this year. And I know Dr. Roy. I've met him several times. We've had some good conversations, and we share a concern about this area. And that sparked, his article in the New York Post sparked the international doctors to come in and also comment on this. So there is progress happening. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics announced a couple of months ago, again, we're in the States, but this applies to Canada, that they were going to undertake a systematic evidence review of the science behind gender transition, especially for kids. And every country that's done that, there's been 6 fulsome evidentiary reviews. They've found that there is no evidence to low quality evidence for performing, medical transition of children, especially with this new cohort. Now, this came up in the Amy Hamm trial, and that's really the piece that we haven't covered this week so far. It's the big piece. And Dr. James Cantor is one of the world's experts on this. And what Cantor and the people studying this issue at CAMH, that's Canadian Association of Mental Health in Toronto, recognized, his colleague Kenneth Zucker created a typology. And a typology is sort of like a map of different categories of, in this case, of medical and psychological presentation. So Cantor came up with a typology that said, okay, there seems to be young boys who experience gender dysphoria. They're typically very effeminate young boys who grow up to be gay. And because they don't have language as children to be able to represent that they're attracted to boys, and that they are more interested and inclined towards female activities, trait typical, let's say, that they were the ones who were presenting to clinics. Of course, parents are bringing them in. And then the other significant type was the autogynephile. And this is an adult presentation of, so transgender isn't one word. And Cantor talked about this in his qualification as an expert in the Amy Hamm hearings quite a bit. Transgender isn't one thing. It isn't as simple as being born in the wrong body. So James, you mentioned this teen onset, this early adolescent onset, more of girls than of boys. And this has been a relatively new type category in this 35, 40-year-old model developed in the 80s by Dr. James Cantor. So we're seeing teen girls who are suddenly identifying as boys with no history of atypical trait interest in masculine behavior, or sort of butchy, tomboyish kind of phenomena, which is great. I mean, there's no Billboard Chris says that there's no wrong way to be a boy or a girl, and there's infinite personalities, and so we shouldn't transition kids. So that the most of the science and the protocols developed and implemented by clinics based on the Dutch protocols, 72 participants in that study, almost all boys or entirely boys, and they fit this young pattern of childhood onset. They were screened for mental health issues otherwise, and given therapy. And then they were, there was processes of sex change, including surgery. Now, one of the participants died of necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating disease, as a consequence of using part of his colon to create a neovagina. So you've got a study of a very small group, which is typical of the studies that are cited to justify transing children and medicalizing them, where 1.3% of the participants had a fatal outcome, and then there was limited follow-up on this group.
Mm-hmm.
So they're only following up for a couple of years. There's a number of participants that were lost to follow up. If I'm not mistaken, the follow-up group was only in the low 50s. So we lost something like 15 or 18 participants to follow up. So we don't know how that turned out. And the scientists can't judge accurately, if that's the case, whether those people benefited or not. Maybe those were the group that had terrible outcomes and their lives were completely destroyed. And then the 50 that we follow up, there was tons of issues with that study, like many of these. So, Amy Hamm has been speaking out about this issue for a couple of years. And it's not just that, she's a registered nurse. If I'm not mistaken, she's a psychiatric nurse. She's been in practice for more than 10 years. She's got a stellar record as a nurse, and works in the, health sciences. Obviously, with some, if I'm right about the psychiatric nurse piece, she's obviously then studied, psychology and abnormal psychology and the protocols for supporting people in her role. The doctors will, diagnose and what have you, and physiology and anatomy. So she's got a reasonable vocabulary around this to be able to say, hey, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't be transing kids. But she's a founding member of COSBAR, which is a terrific organization in Canada, Canadian women's sex-based rights, and has been speaking out about men and women's prisons. There's a number of different points that COSBAR makes. The identification into protected spaces for women and girls, like we saw with this Melody, whatever his name was, from Toronto, a professor of what was it? Cognitive flexibility. No, another word for cognitive flexibility maybe is mental gymnastics, right? In order to be able to think, so Amy Hamm is stating the obvious that, hey, wait a second, a 50-year-old man can't identify as a 13-year-old girl. And wait a second, it's going to make some people uncomfortable and even look like predatory behavior when this man goes into a teenager's dressing room to get changed with them. It's disgusting. But complaints to the BC Nurses, College of Nurses and Midwives, have put Amy Hamm here. She had numerous days last year in hearings in early part of this year, and she had this week, she's next week, and then there's another 3 or 4 days scheduled farther in November. It's possible the way this is getting dragged out, we could be seeing it into 2024.
Wow.
And Cantor is pointing out that these different typologies mean that there has to be, we can't just treat it all as one category. If there are effeminate boys, like I have friends now who are both trans-identified women who present as men and trans-identified men who present as women, who have done a ton of work. I know people with developmental sex disabilities, right? What we used to call developmental sex DSDs, disorders.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially a rare type of birth defect that manifests in a whole bunch of different ways. So we can't categorize them into one group. And I know people like that who have chosen to, change their presentation from what their birth certificate was. And there's a bunch of reasons, legitimate reasons, I think, why people would choose to transition in the rare case. And that's what the medical professionals have been telling us for a long time. But what we've done now, there's not just cats in the classroom. Like there were stories about, and I've heard from across the country, classrooms with almost 50% of kids identifying as queer, non-binary, trans, demi-something, LGBTQ. Just about every classroom in the Ottawa public school system beyond about grade 5 has some kind of pronoun guest. And someone playing with pronouns in the room, and teachers are pushing this. So Amy Hamm spoke out. And she's facing down one of the most notorious lawyers in this area, Barbara Finlay, from British Columbia. Finlay has been on this issue for almost 30 years. And I think I will give her some credit. A bit like Egale. So Egale Canada started as Equality for Gays and Lesbians Everywhere. It was a really important advocacy organization for gays and lesbians, especially during the AIDS crisis, especially, coming out of the time when there was the Toronto bathhouse raids, and, it was illegal essentially to be out and gay. Gay clubs were banned. Employment was an issue. Military was an issue. Like, we had, unfortunately, some terrible laws that we grew out of as a society that made Egale an important contributor to progress. But they lost the plot. And Barbara Finlay was similar. She was working in areas of law that were pushing forward, pushing against the boundaries of these oppressive laws. But when we conquered, all the issues, as gay marriage was legalized and we normalized homosexual and lesbian relationships in our society, and everyone, our generation, went, great, who cares? These organizations and these people needed to make their money from somewhere else, and they continued to push the boundaries rather than saying, okay, job well done, let's move on to something different. They tried to stay in the same area and added the TQ as their advocacy. And Finlay is it's wrong to call her a shark as a lawyer. She's a manipulator, right? Like, I've seen aggressive, really competent lawyers that are going to, they're not afraid to go for the kill. But Finlay she's a manipulator of process.
Yes.
I think it's fair to suspect that there was some kind of coordinated endeavor to get Jon Montpetit and CBC to put up these articles this week. I have a very hard time believing that was coincidence. And this is basically the secret list of witnesses for a hearing of an extremely important case in Canada.
Yeah.
And then we saw Finlay try and introduce the national piece immediately at the beginning of her cross-examination in the Hamm hearings on Tuesday. She was shot down for this. Then she tried to circle back and do it again on another justification. Carin Bondar, who is one of Amy Hamm's lawyer, the other being Lisa Bildy. They're from Lisa's from the JCCF, Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And Bondar is she's the shark. And I say that with the highest compliment. She's aggressive. She will, she called out every single objection that she made to Barbara Finlay over 2 days was sustained, which means that Finlay was shot down.
Yes, I saw that. Something like 19 objections or something like that.
Yeah, it was, I mean, I lost count. And it's got to be frustrating for a panel at some point to recognize that this lawyer just keeps pushing process.
Yeah.
And she feigns this kind of like innocent, like and humble brag sort of position, like, oh, my learned colleague would this and that, like patronizing and she's a bit condescending and morally superior. So she tried to box Cantor into several corners that just didn't work. one of the things that she did was she brought in Dr. Jordan Peterson's case with the Ontario Psychological Association. And I think most people recognize that case. Peterson was investigated due to anonymous complaints, and the Ontario College of Psychologists, or the College of Psychologists of Ontario, CPO, found that he determined he had to take social media training to fix him. And because Cantor is a member of the CPO, he's a psychologist and neuroscientist, Finlay tried to get him to declare his acceptance for the DEI terms required by the CPO for all psychologists. And he very skillfully navigated these questions along with Basto's help. Because I could see where Finlay was going. You want to get him to say that he agrees 100% with the DEI principles. And then your next layer is, well, the DEI principle says this. And so, what you're saying by your research is this, and therefore you don't have, integrity or credibility. So he tried all kinds of games, and there was some good cliffhangers.
Well, that's also a trap too, where he if he says he doesn't agree with Peterson, that means, so you don't support diversity?
That's right.
So
that's right.
There's no way really to answer that without, falling into the trap.
Yeah, well, between Cantor and Basto and her objections, Finlay wasn't able to build that double bind, right? That's the damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And anyway, this thing dragged out. The panel is now deliberating, so they're returning on Tuesday next week, and the panel is now deliberating whether they will accept James Cantor as an expert witness or not. And they've disqualified several experts that were put forward earlier in the year. One of them was Kathleen Stock, the philosophy professor from, I believe, Sussex in the UK, who was run out of her job as a professor. And another was Miriam Grossman, who is also a very, very qualified medical professional. She wrote a book called, anyway, she wrote it.
Do no harm, right? She's do no harm.
Yeah. And I've seen her in interviews, and she's terrific. But to my understanding, both of those witnesses were not qualified as experts for various reasons.
Wow.
So
I'm surprised to hear that about Dr. Grossman. She's very knows her stuff and comes across as very well-spoken, articulate.
Oh yeah.
She said something really cool in that little talk that you sent me. It made me think of it too, what you were talking about a few minutes ago about the research being so incomplete around transing children. So she quoted somebody, and the quote was, "We are building a plane while we are flying it."
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's exactly what the gender ideology is in the trans medical industrial complex. It's let's experiment, let's see what happens, and let's chop up children while we do it.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable that one of the findings in the CAS review, and I'm going to paraphrase, but was essentially, so the CAS review was the independent systematic evidence review by Dr. Hilary Cass in the United Kingdom of the Tavistock Gender Clinic.
Right. This was 2022, right?
The results came out in 2022, but the review had been, the final report still hasn't been written. And they're still gathering facts and evidence, but the interim review came out last March or April, something like that. And she basically paraphrased that ideological capture, which means, that people became so obsessed with the ideology and the rigid dogmas of trans and queer theory within the institution, that they created a toxic environment where medical professionals were given kind of no choice, violate your medical ethics due to ideology and carry on with this, or quit. People were bullied out of their jobs. I think there was more than 30 people turned over in that organization over the course of a couple of short years. There was a whistleblower whose name I forget, but all kinds of scandal around the Tavistock, called the GIDS or the GIDS, Gender Identity Disorder Services Clinic. And the Tavistock was where all of the kids from the UK went for gender services. It was the centralized, that's why it became the largest in the world, whereas we have in Canada and the US distributed clinics that are like semi-private, and they're in hospitals or they're in, research facilities, that sort of thing. And there's no centralized organization. So, we have this ideological capture. We can see it in people like Carin Bondar. We can see it in people like Barbara Finley. We see it in people like Jon Montpetit, senior investigative journalist who can't seem to investigate both sides of an issue. And is perpetuating these lies in the public mind that we've had abundant evidence now for several years is not just wrong, but it's causing serious harms to children.
Yes.
So there was one last thing that kind of floated in at the last minute, James. I think. Yes, this was a bit of news that came out yesterday on Harrison Faulkner's ratioed show on True North.
Okay.
Harrison's a young, full of energy guy. Yeah. And he reported that a municipal councillor in Pickering, which is Durham region, was suspended for 60 days with no pay for putting forward a couple of motions to city council. And this is just, it's kind of like that swimming thing. It's just more of the ridiculous. It is similar to what Amy Hamm is facing, but the city council has the ability to act much more quickly than the nurses college. She proposed to ban or to enforce the policy within the municipality to not fly any other political flags on municipal property.
Right.
And of course, to the activists, that means no more pride flags, no more pride progress flags. How long now? I mean, we joked early this year that it's Pride season, right? Like Trudeau declared Pride season a couple of years ago. It used to be Pride Month was June, and then Pride season, official government websites, June to September, and then we get into October, and it's the Alphabet History Month.
Yes.
Right.
It's
so now we're
century, man.
now we just need one more month, and Pride is like 50% of the year.
Yeah.
And the flags are so ubiquitous. I mean, everywhere from IKEA crosswalks and parking lots, and your walk up to the door is rainbow, and the rainbow bags you get there, to so many businesses hanging the progress flag in the window. It's hard to imagine that that the TQ cohort is oppressed in any way when they're getting millions of dollars a year in funding. No one's allowed to criticize them, and the councillor's named Lisa Robinson now faces 2 months with no pay for saying maybe we shouldn't have flags flying constantly on municipal property.
That's insane. Somebody that clearly wants to turn down the volume on all of the political animosity going on in education. That's probably the smartest person in the room, and no one wants to listen to her.
Yeah. Well, we're a little bit divided. We're going to kind of, speaking of building the plane as we're flying, we're going to try and land it now, James. There's some news coming out about another date for Hands Off Our Kids, Save the Children March in February. It just sort of flashed by my awareness. So it looks like rather than try and do something a month later, we've got several months to work forward to it as various groups across the country. What else is going on? We've got the Amy Hamm hearings continuing this week. I'll be covering those for a couple of days. It was fun to do some tweet threads about that.
Good. It saved me from having to watch it, having to sit through all that.
A lot of it is, okay, now we're going to go and we're going to deliberate on this objection. We'll be back in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
like over and over and over
so
again.
Many breaks.
Yeah. So, not a lot of productive work getting done. But like you and I both have, your day job is you run a renovations company and you're in construction. A lot of your time is setup and breakdown, right? So similar in law, you've got the setup, you've got the breakdown, you've got the little, oh shit, I've got to change the blade on this for something else. That's kind of how the legal process is working. So we'll keep an eye on the gender stuff this week. February, there's going to be another parents' march. Anything to add in? I'm trying to remember what the other thing that Lisa Robinson was. So it was the flags. She was protesting about, or she
Something
tried to pass.
Bathroom policy.
Was it bathroom?
Or washroom policy.
Drag Queen Story Hour.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
at public institutions, right? Or public buildings.
And municipal libraries, public libraries, that sort of thing, to limit the age for children to be able to see the Drag Queen Story Hour. Anyway, so we're going to track what's going on with Lisa.
What a bigot! How dare she?
Yeah. Man, well, look, maybe, because you follow this in a broader, the wokeness in a broader scale, and you're writing for Woke Watch. What is your sense in the last couple of weeks? Because, we've had this issue of the pogrom in Israel and the massacre by Hamas of Israelis on the 7th of October. And we've seen institution after institution. We've seen a bunch in Ontario. There was the York students. There was another, I think it was the former Ryerson law faculty. A bunch of students signed this thing, like obviously supporting terrorism, indiscriminate murder, and presenting this naked anti-Semitism. And it really, a lot of the people who are pushing this are the same people as are, right? They're the woke ideologues that are pushing queer theory are pushing this anti-Semitism because they perceive Israel and Jewish people as oppressors and Palestinians as oppressed. A little outside of our scope as gender wars, but you've got maybe some unique insights into this because of all the work that you do, James. What does this, start to bring down wokeness? Is this the big enough issue?
I thought that the pogrom would have. The pogrom itself, the atrocities that were committed. I thought that was going to be the thing that would make people realize that things like decolonization, this theory of settler colonialism, which is a highly woke idea, comes from Edward Said, Palestinian scholar from the 1970s. I thought that just because the just unbelievable level of savagery, the fact that they had GoPros attached to their heads and they filmed it and they broadcasted it and they were gleeful in it and they called their parents and bragged about it and their parents were just as happy as they were. I thought that would be the thing to wake people up out of their fucking stupor. But no, it was not. We have anti-Semites en masse, just as gleeful as the actual Hamas murderers, who I don't even want to talk about the things that they did, but it's inhuman. It's the best descriptor of what these murderers did is what's his name, the historian, Victor Davis Hanson. It's pre-civilizational.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, the answer to these, I believe that the answer to wokeism is for people who were born in the Western world, people who are born into Western civilization, have got to start studying history more. No matter what the subject is, when something happens in the news, my instinct is to study the history of it. I don't care about the current event. You can't understand the current event if you don't have the historical context. And very few people have the historical context when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. When it comes to any issue, it's like we're anti-history in the West. We've become anti-history. We've just decided that we were terrible in the past, so we'd rather not talk about it or think about it. And that's the huge problem. So I think that the solution to wokeism is, number one, to study history, but also to specifically too, like to study world history, but to study what distinguishes the Western world from all of these other ancient civilizations. China is an ancient civilization. Russia is an ancient civilization. The Middle East are. We keep acting in the West like we're going to be able to partner with these ancient civilizations and that they're going to interface with us in a liberal framework. And they are not going to. If they fool us into thinking that they are, what needs to wake us up is when thousands and thousands of anti-Semites take to the streets in Western countries that we have allowed to come in under the framework of multiculturalism and said, yeah, come in and no assimilation. You don't have to act like us. You don't have to take up our values. None of that stuff. You can bring your ancient culture to Canada and set it up, and it'll be great. It'll be diversity. Well, it's not great because not all civilizations, not all cultures are equal. They're just not. And like the great conservative theorist Robert Scruton, if we want to believe what he says, which I do, we have to be able to critique culture separate from race. It's really wrong to say that there's a race of people that are superior to another race of people. And I can prove that that's not only is it wrong, it's incorrect. Because anyone, there could be someone with a completely opposite of me. They could have the darkest shade of skin possible. But if they speak English and they speak in my accent and they're born in the West and they're Christian and they're liberal, I have way more in common with that person than with a white person who's from Eastern Europe who doesn't speak my language or speaks it with a really thick accent and believes in communism, not liberalism. So this is not a race thing. This is the idea of just liberalism and its unchecked inclusivity means that we are transplanting the worst aspects of ancient cultures into a modern civilization where the things are not commensurate with each other.
Yep.
And it doesn't belong. Savagery and barbarism does not belong in Western civilization. And this diabolical hatred that so many people in the Islamic world, and it's not just Palestinians, this is a huge problem of the Islamic world. They have a diabolical hatred of Jewish people. It's insane. And it's not commensurate in any way with modern civilization. We do not hate people. We do not murder people simply because of what ethnic group they're part of.
Yeah. Well, the relativism, to try and just accept everybody and include everybody. I mean, we see that in the 50-year-old man in the swimming competition. It's sort of the same distorted thought process across these multiple domains. A lot of us who've been following the gender things and the craziness for years have been saying this is like transing kids and doing medical experiments has got to be the thing. It's got to be the thing that tips the scales here, wakes people up to how toxic and how quite frankly insane this ideology is.
Well, I thought it would be the thing too. Except you can use logic and words to convince people that you're actually doing care. It's affirmative care. It's medical care.
Yeah.
I can see why people can be led to believe that this particular type of harm is actually good. But when it comes to Hamas terrorists entering Israel, the country of Israel, and literally slaughtering people, and they tortured people to death. They didn't just kill them. There's where is there any confusion about where is there moral confusion there? So as bad as transing children is, and I'm with you 100%. We talked about this before. I just don't believe that a child can exercise the freedom of conscience that's necessary to say, yeah, I want to undergo a double mastectomy. So it's illiberal to trans children, let alone that it's unscientific. But I can understand the moral confusion, sort of. But I don't understand the moral confusion of Hamas supporters. I just don't understand that at all. And I do think that it may lead to the thing that will reverse the course, because a lot of people are like, especially as more details come out about what actually happened on October 7th. And then people in the West realize, like, look at all these people who we thought were just our nice neighbors or people that we work with or whatever, or the nice, whatever. They're all like in the street waving, Palestinian flags, screaming, "Gas the Jews!" That has got to be the thing. If this does not wake the West up, then I think that it's the thing that will just means, okay, well, we're completely finished. Then there's no helping us, because you can't, like, we've hit rock bottom when we're going to be out there screaming, giving speeches. Harsha Walia giving these rousing political speeches, talking about how glorious it was to see the Hamas terrorist and hang gliders entering Israel space so that they could massacre 260 kids. Harsha Walia is giving a big speech with hundreds of people in the streets cheering her on. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. We're in a head-shaking moment of history, James. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is that 5 minutes ago there was no such thing as a trans kid.
Yes.
Right. And just basic, mental, any kind of mental engagement on the issue should blow up this narrative. If you think about it, hey, I'm in my 50s. There were no, yes, there were masculine presenting girls, tomboys when I went to school. There were effeminate boys, but to justify, sex changing them, and the psychosocial protocols at schools to be administered to children in the absence of their parents, that came out of nowhere, 5 years ago. And then to have our Supreme Court in Canada say that this group is historically marginalized. Well, one of the trans narratives is that you want to erase trans people from existence. Well, I'm sorry. By all metrics, you didn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. Anyhow, we could go on about this. James, I really appreciate your insights this week, especially the bigger picture stuff. We've seen the Queers for Palestine thing, and that's a whole other subject matter. These rainbow activists, pushing to support, people from Gaza and the Palestinians against oppression just because they hate all oppressors, don't realize that they would be they wouldn't last 5 minutes in these communities without being like thrown off a building, literally. So
yes,
it's a complicated world we live in. The intertwined and interconnection of this ideology suddenly drew big lines through their world, and hopefully we see more coming to light. One last thing I would finish with. I grew up and I've shared this before. I grew up, unfortunately, with a narcissist in my household. And the narcissist creates a narrative. They create a false reality with the world outside that they enforce. And they really don't like people telling the truth, especially people from inside, right? So this is what's happening at scale, I think, with the world that we live in. We've got people like Amy Hamm, who's pushing back against a narcissistic system, create a completely false reality, and will defend it with unbelievable tools that are, they're straight out of the narcissist abusers playbook. If you want to understand what's going on at scale, you look at how a dysfunctional family works, where there's an alcoholic or where there's a personality disorder or an addict of some sort, or someone who's bent on power and domination within a family. And then you just look at how those tactics get applied at a large scale. For people who are coming out of narcissistic relationships and trying to sort themselves out, it's a difficult process. We have to get to the point, and one psychologist I've been following for, 15 years, her name is Dr. Tara Palmatier, and she talks about the what the fuck moment. It's like, you got to get to the point where it's not just what the fuck, it's like, that's it.
Yeah.
We're done. And the trauma bond that is created between the abuser and the abused is, for a lot of people, it is very hard to escape. So we're in that place right now where we've had a couple of giant what the fuck moments.
Yes.
And when you start looking at, like, all reasonable people should say, what the fuck is a 50-year-old man doing in change rooms with 13-year-old girls? Because he identified.
What I'm saying what the fuck about is, why aren't they saying what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like okay, at this point we know there's a bunch of perverts.
Yeah.
Living among us, moving among us, and they want to get next to our kids. We know this. That's not a big deal.
Always been the case.
It's always been the case. But what's surprising is that parents are like clapping along with it. Oh, yay, it's inclusive.
Yeah. Well, that I've studied some of the history of the residential schools, and there were, like, orphanages in Canada, like boarding schools, like mental institutions. There were predators who were very attracted to those environments because there were, generations ago, there were no rules, if any rules. There was child abuse laws didn't show up in Canada until the early to mid 1970s. We didn't even have vocabulary around this stuff, right?
Yes.
And we know that predators seek out environments where they can have access to their prey. And that's always been the case. And they will bend the rules, and they will present themselves one way or in whatever way it takes them to get access to their targets. And that's exactly what some of these predatory men are doing. They're using these excuses to access our kids. And we need to wake up to that here in Canada, and we need to collectively say no. We need to have the courage of people like Lisa Robinson and Amy Hamm and others who are speaking up against this to pay consequences that need to be paid in order to, Amy Hamm is what's coming out. The last thing I'll finish with, and I keep saying that, I've had access to a public opinion AI, a very sophisticated one, maybe the best one in Canada. Miley, yeah.
Miley.
And Miley's a code name. The organization that we're working with has had documentary films made about them. They have narrow margins of error in public opinion polling than the Legers of the world, than the Angus Reeds. They use big data and number crunching to survey online what people are talking about and what people are saying. And the support for Amy Hamm in Canada is close to 90%.
I saw that. That's awesome.
It's extraordinary, the level of support. The conversation online about her is overwhelmingly positive. There's a lot of frustration with the BC College of Nurses and Midwives. What Miley doesn't understand is that there's a kind of this desire for punishment that's coming up in this conversation, and what seems to be the case is that the anger is directed towards the BCCNM, not Hamm herself.
Right.
and the AI is confusing the two.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, you cleared that up though. It made sense with what you said, and it's something like it's 4 out of 5 are supporting Amy, right?
Yeah.
So that's huge.
So well, I'll track it again this coming week, and if I've got time, I'll do the tweet threads again and track that. And James, I really appreciate you being on the show today and sharing your insights. We've gone a little bit into long form, and I hope it all splices together well because we had some technical issues.
Fingers crossed.
That's right. Well, great chatting with you, James, and thanks for coming on the show and co-hosting. And everybody, check out Woke Watch Canada newsletter. Some great writing happening there from James and from other contributors as well, from various domains. And talk to you again soon, James.
Okay, man. We'll talk to you soon. Ciao.